The Euros was on its deathbed. It seems hard to believe now, what with the incessant wall-to-wall coverage, build-up, hype and money that goes into the Euros these days. However, UEFA had just suffered humiliation in staging a cagey, defensive, Jose Mourinho wet dream of a tournament in Italy. They desperately needed to reshape the image of the Euros or risk its premature death. This is the story of Euro 1984. So the Euros was officially on its arse. Nobody had bothered to turn out to the previous tournament, and when they did, all they wanted to do was offer each other out for a bare knuckle. One diktat, one obvious measure to make the football better was to return the semi-final to the championship after the strange phobia UEFA and FIFA both had with it in the 70s. On the hooliganism front, UEFA were helped out massively by the failure from England to qualify. The paranoia of the continent could rest easy that England supporters wouldn't be descending on France. England had transitioned from failing to live up to their potential under Ron Greenwood to failing to live up to their potential under Bobby Robson after Danish Dynamite imploded English hopes at Wembley in 1983. The 80s would be transformative for Denmark under Sepp Piontek as the country finally embraced professionalism in the game and allowed an outsider, a West German no less, to control the team. Piontek ruled with a boxing glove made of velvet, cultivated a strong atmosphere within the camp where effectively 20% of the players were ferried in from abroad each international break. At the heart of their team, the teenaged Michael Laudrup, who was busy setting Serie A alight. The cast of characters from Søren Lerby, Frank Arnesen and Morten Olsen made for an incredible unit, and that's before we mention the incredible Alan Simonsen. Unfortunately, towards the back end of an astonishing career, Simonsen would break his major international tournament debut, duck, aged 31. Their qualification in 1984 marked the first summer in a long association with the Euros, one that only Germany could match in the same 20-year time frame. Joining England on the sofa of depression in the summer of '84 was Italy, the world champions, marking the only time that a European world champion had failed to qualify for the subsequent Euros. Hadn't been done before, hasn't been done since. They had dredged themselves out of hosting the horrific 1980 tournament, they'd cleansed themselves from Totonero, and the likes of Roma and Juventus were busy ruling Europe in the club game. On the international side of things, unfortunately, Italy scored in just 3 of 8 qualifiers and only claimed victory on the final day against lowly Cyprus. It wasn't all doom and gloom for the home nations, even if no British or Irish teams made the championships in France. Wales and Northern Ireland, for example, put out a good account of themselves despite not qualifying for any major tournament since the 1958 World Cup in Sweden. A Welsh team spearheaded by Ian Rush scored 4 away from home in Yugoslavia. Normally this would result in a win, but on this occasion in Belgrade, they could only manage a draw. After this goal frenzy, Wales' tally dried up. Nonetheless, they were mere seconds away from the championships when Yugoslavia were being held to a 2-2 draw at home to Bulgaria on the final day. When Bulgaria had a golden chance to shock the Yugoslavs, Welsh fans would have been forgiven for buying the next plane ticket to Paris, only for disaster to strike moments later when Lubomir Radanovic nodded in a shock winner. Wales stayed at home, as always, and Yugoslavia snuck in through the back door once again. Northern Ireland got close too, but sometimes the weight of history plays its part more than any kind of momentum can. Goals from Ian Stewart and Norman Whiteside led a scarcely believable double over the holders West Germany in Belfast in November 1982 and Hamburg 364 days later. So West Germany, who had won the prior Euros, had gotten to the previous World Cup final, were heading out. They hosted Albania in their final game in Saarbrücken. Saarbrücken presumably chosen by the DFB to soften the blow should they fail to win the 2 points necessary to qualify. It appeared a shrewd choice when Albania took the lead on 22 minutes. Unfortunately for the Green and White Army of Northern Ireland, West Germany levelled things up instantly and Gerhard Strack found the winner 11 minutes from time. It had been a hellacious qualifying campaign for the West Germans, almost as hellacious as the tackle Harald Schumacher stitched on Patrick Battiston in the World Cup semi-final. First, Bernd Schuster had the damn cheek to attend his daughter's birth instead of playing a qualifier in Albania, the bastard. The whole affair led to Schuster's international retirement, marking a lost wonderful career for his nation. He wouldn't have played at the championships anyway, breaking his foot prior to the summer. Schuster wasn't the only prolonged absentee for Jupp Derval. Paul Breitner was missing, as were Hansi Muller and Felix Magath, which made for a pretty tepid midfield. If the 1980s championships were barren, the qualifying campaign for '84 set about adding yet more heartache, as the batshit group featuring Spain and the Netherlands attests to. The Dutch's time at the top was definitively over when they were beaten to the 1982 World Cup by Belgium of all countries, and Spain had attempted to soothe their own travails from '82 by appointing the legendary figure of Miguel Munoz. The group went very much to form. Spain and the Netherlands battled it out to the very last day, except UEFA hadn't learned their lessons from the disgrace of Gijón yet and implemented simultaneous kickoffs for the final match day. Consequently, the schedule was all cockeyed and featured Malta travelling to both Rotterdam and Seville in the week before Christmas '83. Netherlands thought they had done enough. They stuffed the Maltese by 5 goals, which left Spain needing an 11-goal triumph over the same opposition 4 days later. Have a wild guess at how many goals Spain won by then. Yeah, 11. Silvio De Moale even had the fucking temerity to score for Malta midway through the first half, levelling the game up at 1-1. Over the next 54 minutes, the angry Spaniards scorched the Seville earth, slapping 11 goals beyond their opponents, winning 12-1 and qualifying on goals scored. Closing out the field of 8 teams in France were Fernando Cabrita's Portugal, who were welcomed into their first European Championships and first major tournament altogether since 1966. The side were built on the solid FC Porto defence, which would go on to claim the European Cup in 1987. They were also well serviced by the incredible winger Paulo Futre, but their steely disposition crept them over the line against the Soviet Union thanks to a penalty in the final qualifier in Lisbon. Funneled into the other group were Belgium, who continued to build on Guy Thyssen's great work in the early part of the decade. The nation had finally delivered in the club game, largely thanks to Anderlecht's wonderful team that claimed the Cup Winners' Cup and UEFA Cup and would appear in the European Cup semi-finals in 1986. They achieved a 100% record to qualify with a few games to spare and could ease off the gas. This despite the match-fixing scandal back home that centred around Standard Liège and claimed the international careers of Eric Goretz and Walter Moos. Another nation that had exceeded expectations in the club game were Romania. Steaua were due to reign as European champions in 2 years' time, whilst Dynamo Bucharest faltered in the same competition at the semi-final stage to the almighty Liverpool, weeks out from the finals in France. They were led by the diminutive teenager Georgi Hagi and qualified for their first Euros thanks to a great display in Bratislava against 1976 champions Czechoslovakia. And finally the hosts, France, who hadn't featured in the European Championships in any guise since hosting the first edition in 1960. They'd roared back to successes after failing to capitalise on a stunning Saint-Étienne team on the continent in the 70s and were powered by a L'écart Magique midfield, which featured Luis Fernandez, Alain Giresse, Jean Tigana and Michel Platini. Reaching the semi-finals of the prior World Cup, they were buoyant and expected to go the distance on home soil after finally fixing their goalkeeper problem by sending Joel Bats to the number 1 jersey. Fears of a lack of a support for Euro 84 were quickly allayed when 30,000 Danes marched on France, and a sizable chunk of those witnessed the tournament's opener between Denmark and the hosts inside the Parc des Princes. It was a show of a match which belied the kind of tournament Denmark would be able to look back on fondly in another generation. Firstly, Alan Simonson's excruciating wait to play in a major tournament was over pretty much before it begun, when Yvon Leroux snapped his leg in a 50-50 challenge moments before the half-time break. Secondly, a moment of mastery from Michel Platini delivered the winning goal 12 minutes from time. This, despite fears from the Juve midfielder and multiple-time Ballon d'Or winner that his national teammates of a Bordeaux persuasion were more inclined to pass to one another rather than to himself. In the end, those fears were promptly allayed, and it was their midfield that lit up Nantes against Belgium in their second match. Michel Platini himself helped himself to a treble as Les Bleus romped home to the semi-finals by way of a 5-0 humbling of Guy Tace's team. It was the perfect performance for the seemingly perfect team. Belgium was still in the mix come the final match, however, and they had a victory over Yugoslavia on opening night to thank for that. Tace had enough confidence in Enzo Scifo, barely an adult, to run the game, and he was quickly rewarded as 2 goals before the half-time break confirmed the 2 points ahead of a crunch game with Denmark. If Belgium had Enzo Scifo, Yugoslavia had their own teenaged wonder kid by the name of Dragan Stojkovic. Whilst he dazzled in an imperfect team, he couldn't stop the whitewash of results from Group A, completed by France on matchday 3, but crucially against Denmark in Lyon beforehand. Denmark had presumably witnessed or heard about how France slapped Belgium 5-0 and fancied a bit of that themselves. This was the Danish Dynamite exploding into the stratosphere as Frank Arnesen, Michael Laudrup, Preben Elkjær and Klaus Berggren helped themselves to the goals in a thumping. It left Denmark needing a point against Belgium in the final game to qualify for the semi-finals, the country's next acid test in an important tournament contest. Learning their lessons of Gijón and Seville, the final group matches were finally staged simultaneously, despite neither France or Yugoslavia able to truly benefit with hindsight. Yugoslavia were out despite their pretty football and devastating attack, whilst France were already through and needed just a point to confirm top spot. Of course, they confirmed all the points from yet another hat-trick from Michel Platini, the first and probably only time a player will ever accomplish the feat of successive hat-tricks at the same Euros. Yugoslavia did have their moments, however, and went into the half-time break 1-up, but quickly found themselves dispatched by the overwhelming quality of Platini as Hidalgo shifted from a 3-5-2 to the squad's benefit. Strasbourg was the scene of the most intense game of football at the championships and arguably the most important match of the groups. Neither Belgium or Denmark could class themselves as running in the same elite circles as Brazil, Germany, Argentina or Italy, but they were well on their way to reaching that point. Both had unerring quality, could be unstoppable on their day and were coached by incredible managers. The match, given the desperation from both nations, descended into a scrap as flight gave way for fight. Soon enough, the match would take off into an instant classic. Jan Koelemans and Frankie Vercouteren had fired Belgium into a late lead in the first half and were going through to another semi-final, even if Denmark did well to grab some momentum back through a Frank Arnesen penalty. The game and perhaps entire championship spun on a miss mere moments into the second half. Threaded through by Koelemans, Erwin van den Berg fired against Uli Hesse's legs in the Danish net. A gilt-edged chance Belgium never truly recovered, and the resilient Danes found their place into only a second ever semi-final in international competition through substitute Kenneth Brill and Preben Elkjær. Neither side deserved to lose their place in the European Championships after such an intensely fought contest. Less could be said about the combatants from Group B, however. On paper, with 2024 eyes, Group B with Germany, Spain and Portugal looks the more enticing prospect and might well have been 40 years prior in advance of the tournament. However, this included both Spain and West Germany, who were rough around the edges and performing far from their best, and a Portugal side hell-bent on winning the trophy through any means necessary. In-house fighting pocked the start of the West German campaign between sweeper Uli Hesse and goalkeeper Harald Schumacher. Schumacher desired his Köln teammate Gerhard Strack ahead of him, and the DFB told them all to pack it in and quit acting like bairns without a bottle. Schumacher had enough on his plate too, as the French fans in attendance weren't about to forget his GBH on Patrick Battiston 2 years prior, which cost Le Bleu a first World Cup final. In places like Strasbourg, Lens and Paris, he was quick to be reminded of his crimes every time he touched the ball. The whole West German team played nervously low, as Jupp Derval took time to lament his decimated midfield the most. They kicked off their tournament against an equally brutish Portuguese outfit, and the Seleção were more than happy to claim a point. Meanwhile, back home, it was a night of the long knives, as media outlet Kicker described it as the worst of times. Romania, a country expected to do their bit, play 3 matches against superior opposition, hope not to get humiliated and piss off home, had their own worries. This, still in the times of the Cold War, Romania's FA was so paranoid that the team might defect to the West en masse, set about thwarting their chances of coming into contact with what they deemed Western propaganda. Therefore, televisions were switched off, phone lines were cut, and the players suffered from an intense boredom for the week. The players were reportedly handed an allowance of barely £3 per day and had to rely on generous expat Romanians in France. Their misery couldn't have been further from their minds when they finally lined up for the start of their championships against Spain in Saint Etienne. In probably the only poorly attended match, Romania showed their qualities against what was a pretty abject La Roja. A fortunate early Spain penalty was equalised before the break, and an unadventurous Spanish team made do with a point in a match they should have lost. It placed all teams level on points going into the second match day, as the torment of Group B continued in the same vein. West Germany barely showed up in their next encounter with Romania in Lens, not through a lack of desire or infighting, but because their bus driver missed the exit off the motorway, and subsequent traffic around the ground as well as loopy country roads cut the journey incredibly fine. After DFB officials had to help shovel luggage off the bus and into the dressing room, West Germany barely remembered they had a game to play. Despite a resilience from Romania, the performance of Klaus Olofs and the goals from Rudi Voller secured the win and likely progression to the semi-finals for the West Germans. Romania, after all, hadn't embarrassed themselves and were still in with a slender chance of progression, particularly once Portugal and Spain eased to a point apiece in Marseille. Portugal returned to the field with the same brutish outlook on life as they had done against the West Germans, while Spain showed few signs of improvement from their own tepid draw against Romania. Typically, the points were shared. It left a barely functioning West Germany top, 2 inspiring Iberian nations either side of the qualification line, and a prideful Romania propping up the group with half a chance. They travelled to Nantes to meet Portugal, feasibly their easiest game on paper. Mircea Lucescu's side needed a win and hoped that Spain didn't beat West Germany. Considering that Romania had been more frequent at major international tournament finals historically and West Germany's reputation preceded Spain's, why couldn't it become a reality? It couldn't become a reality because of decisions like leaving Georgi Hagi on the bench for the country's biggest game in its history. Also, in fighting fire with fire, Romania became uninspiring despite the talents of players such as the metronomic Laszlo Bologna and the attacking might of Marcel Coraș. Hagi remained on the bench for the full 90, the majority of which Romania held in there with a point still attached to their names and a slim opportunity to qualify. Their championships crumbled thanks to Nene's 81st minute winner, the Portuguese attacker's last goal for his country. Portugal were through as a result, no matter what the outcome that ran concurrently in Paris between Spain and West Germany, which each towards a similarly set stalemate. Portugal's qualification belied their problems. With hindsight in mind, players have since spoken of the tensions between players of Benfica and Porto, as well as coaches who fronted up one faction over the other. Diamantino had said some years later that the results concealed the problems. And speaking of problems, let's shuffle up north to Paris, where West Germany would become enveloped into a world of pain. Playing for a draw in a match in which they could feasibly win comfortably, they were deservingly stung in stoppage time by Makeda. Not that one. The defender has since remarked on how much better the West Germans were than his Spanish team. The difference between the two was that their opponents couldn't hit cow's ass with a banjo, whilst the defender took one of Spain's rare chances late on in the day. Captain Luis Arconada had been vilified for his part in his country's abject performance at their World Cup 2 years prior. Now he was their hero, and only one of the reasons why they would remain in the championship. Had a goal not been found in the match between Spain and West Germany, lots would have been drawn to separate Portugal with the West Germans for top spot in the group. It might have been the most entertaining aspect of the group if it had happened. But it was both Portugal and Spain sneaking in through the back door into the semi-finals. Spanish FA President Pablo Porta summed up the national mood by claiming Miguel Munoz was quote-unquote born with a flower up his arse. Which means undeserved luck, apparently. Meanwhile, the West German pile-on began in earnest. French outlet Libération remarked, "German football deserves to be drowned in its own urine," whilst tabloid Bild surprisingly ended the toilet-based metaphors by all but announcing their next manager. The headline, quoted from a legend of German football, Franz Beckenbauer, read, "I am ready." Yes, the DFB had broken from tradition to sack their first ever manager, ridding themselves of Jupp Derval, albeit with the official dignity of announcing that he had resigned. West German football was in the toilet, Spain weren't that much better off, Portugal was still happy to be alive, and Romania could hold on to their pride, even if they had squandered a golden chance. The semi-finals were back, which helped illuminate some of the group stages, but helped pencil in two enormous matches prior to the final in Paris. Portugal met the hosts and rampant favourites France, while Spain and Denmark began what would become one of the often forgotten feuds of international football. Only outside forces could seemingly stop France from winning their first piece of major international silverware. So, when France travelled on the team bus to the velodrome in Marseille and their vehicle was involved in a crash, Les Bleus might have been knocked off course. However, despite injuries to some players, they were only made stronger. Jean Tigana, one of the more affected by the crash, almost resolved on his own to ensure France's place in the final. The stop-start nature of the first half and France's bizarrely direct tactics only served to help the rugged Portuguese through the opening stages. About the only highlight from the first part of the opening half were the goalkeepers drilling goal kicks to one another, such was the directness on display in Marseille. Both were too scared to lose despite France's rocky preparations for the match. It might not have helped that Didier Cisse was being jeered upon his every touch by Marseille fans in attendance for his part and subsequent desertion of Marseille after their relegation 2 years prior. Life was breathed into the contest by Jean-François Domergue as the fullback opened the scoring midway through the first period. Momentum was theirs to be had through the second, but Les Bleus couldn't capitalise on proceedings. If anything, Portugal looked the more likely team into the final, bizarrely, once Jordão equalised and Nene spurned an absolutely glorious chance for the most undeserved smash and grab in Euros history. What is it about France and Portugal in a European Championships on French soil that springs up these narratives? Joël Batz, the goalkeeper, plunged into the first team for his first competitive internationals. Prior to the tournament, was keeping his team in the competition. Until he wasn't, when Jordão bagged Portugal's second goal. Thankfully for the host, the match had lapsed into 30 extra minutes and the golden goal hadn't been dreamt up as a concept yet. France had time to respond, and respond they did. In a bout of pinball in the box, Platini got hold of the ball before tumbling under a Portuguese challenge in the box. With all the pressure of the continent on the referee's shoulders, he could have buckled to give the penalty. Fortunately for his sake, Jean-François Domergue pounced on the loose ball to level the tie up. A French semi-final with a defender scoring his only 2 goals of an international career on home soil. Lilian Thuram in 1998 move aside, Domergue was the original. At least the sturdy Portuguese defence could hang on for 6 more minutes, right? Wrong. Jean Tigana had had quite the birthday already. First he woke up with the excitement of playing in his country's 4th ever major tournament semi-final, then he got injured in a bus crash, and finally he topped it off with his greatest contribution to his country in the depths of extra time. The coaches on the sideline were busy determining the penalty takers for the ensuing shootout when Jean Tigana brute forced his way through Portugal, prompting an immortal strand of commentary from John Motson. He laid a spot in the final on a plate for Michel Platini, who simply had to take his chance. He did, and the limbs of the velodrome denoted no way back for Portugal. Now it was the turn of Spain and Denmark to meet them in their Paris coronation. The army of Danes remained housed in France, drinking entire cities dry of beer and moving on to wine when they had done so. Neutrals favourite for their supporters' antic, a tonic to the usual 80s fare. Their nation's football had gripped the continent. Meanwhile, there was also Spain. They were okay. The match went as most people in the know expected. Soren Lerby fired the Danes into an early lead at the Stade Hollande in Lyon. Now they just had to kill the game off. Kill the game off they didn't, and they were punished for it. If Jean-Francois Domergue was France's unlikely hero, then Antonio Macheda was cast in a similar role for Spain. He'd already played his part when he scored twice in the 12-1 nonsense against Malta, then scored again to continue Spain's presence at Euro 84 against Germany. The sweeper repeated the feat against Denmark, killing another game of 1984 pinball by smashing a loose ball into the corner that left Danish Dynamite defused. From a personal perspective, it would remain a shame that in receiving his second yellow card of the championships, Macheda would join teammate Raphael Gordillo in being suspended for the final. Also unfortunate, Klaus Berggren would miss the final if Denmark reached it due to his red card for a pullback in extra time. A textbook definition of a yellow in 2024, but a little harsh for 1984, especially in a game that was robust in places. Extra time winced into the penalty shootouts as the nerve-ridden team settled for the draw and pinned all hope on converted penalties to join France in the final. The first 8 kicks were dispatched as Uli Hesse and Luis Arconada acted as mere placeholders in the set piece. Then the environment took its victim, the almost peerless Preben Elkjær, the man who had worked tirelessly to deliver Denmark to the finals, the man who scored the goal that confirmed their progression to the semi-finals, shanked his kick over the bar. All Manuel Sarabia had to do then was to find the net. His nerves were abundantly clear when he tiptoed up to the spot, forgetting he was wearing his tracksuit top. Having to make the nerve-shredding walk to the penalty spot twice, Sarabia found the net that sent Spain into the final. Undeserving of their spot in the showpiece event ahead of Denmark on the basis of the championships, but the inexperience of the Danes in international football had told, as they could not put away their chances. Denmark and Spain would meet again at the next 2 major tournaments and in qualification twice in the 1990s. France, the swashbuckling attacking host with the best players, best outlook and best cohesion, met Spain, the rough but ready band of players that ought to have been on an 1830 resort in Costa Brava, yet the final was closer than it had any right to be. The players were riddled with it, even the marching band that couldn't wait to zoom through both national anthems were riddled with it. The entire country's disposition teetered on the brink as Les Bleus lined up for their first ever international tournament final. Spain had enough tricks up their sleeves to limit the damage that France could cause. First they went after the obvious, Luis Fernandez at the base of a magical French midfield. Fernandez, born in Andalusia, was targeted all game with spats and challenges because he was deemed a traitor in the eyes of the Spanish. La Roja had the best chances too, but Santillana fluffed both of them. He was thwarted by Patrick Battiston on the line for one and wedged the other fruitlessly wide. France got into the game through no tact or skill of their own, but a generous piece of officiating that deemed Les Bleus worthy of a free kick when one of their number had gone down on their own steam, slipping on the turf. Michel Platini nonchalantly strode up to his mark in Gallic fashion, curled an awful low free kick towards the bottom corner. Awfully taken, yet awful for the goalkeeper as it bounced into his grasp, terminally loose. Our Canada, so impressive all tournament, reverted to the median as the ball squeaked through over the line before he could retrieve it. France were ahead, probably undeservingly. Spain's chances, though, continued, once Yvonne Leroux was shown a second yellow card for a cynical challenge. Les Bleus were clinging on as a teary-eyed Hidalgo watched his French team find a resolve before finally the ball squirted loose for a breakaway. Bruno Bellone latched onto it. A forward who found the net for his national team twice in 34 games lofted the ball deliciously into the net, like a player who bagged 40 a season. Pressure relieved, France could finally celebrate becoming champions of Europe. The European Championships was officially rescued. The competition had a new lease on life, and it was thanks to the minute tweaks created by UEFA that really ought not to be necessary in the first place. Abolishing the needless playoff to separate bronze from irrelevance was a good step, but not as transformative as the seemingly obvious act of sending 4 teams from the 2 groups into the semi-finals. After all, the competitions prior had flourished in a 4-team knockout bout. Whilst the Euros had witnessed better knockout stages, namely in 1960 and 76, the group stages were revitalised with the carrot that was allowing second-place teams to go through. Thanks to that move, we were blessed with Danish Dynamite following an exuberant host nation into the semis, and a blasé West German outfit being scuppered by the Iberian duo of Portugal and Spain. The right team won, football as a whole were victorious, and on the other side of Mexico 86, there was fresh excitement in a tournament that captivated most of the continent. Find out tomorrow the story of Euro 88 as UEFA entered a brave new era.